What would you do if the world had written you off? If every door had been shut in your face and the only thing left in your pocket was $2 silver and a name nobody cared to remember? That is exactly where a young woman named Marjorie Slade found herself in the hard, unforgiving country of 1880s, Idaho. With her last $2, she bought the one thing even more forgotten than she was: a collapsed cabin no one had seen in a decade, deeded to a trapper who walked into the mountains one autumn and never came back. The townspeople called her a fool. A speculator named Boone Eckhart laughed in her face and told her the mountain would eat her alive. But Marjorie was not buying a cabin. She was buying silence, a place so far from the world that no one would bother to follow her there. She was wrong about that, because what she found beneath a loose stone in that ruined hearth was not just a dead man's secret. It was a challenge. A trail of hidden maps that led deeper and deeper into the Sawtooth Range toward a discovery that someone had gone to terrible lengths to keep hidden. And someone was following her. Settle in and stay close. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from today as we tell the story of the trapper's last survey. Marjorie Slade arrived in the raw little town of Ketchum with the dust of the road ground into the hem of her only good dress and the silence of dismissal ringing in her ears. She was 21 years old, but the last 6 months serving in the house of a Boise timber baron had aged her spirit by a decade. She had been let go over a broken porcelain pitcher, a thing she had not even touched. But the lady of the house needed someone to blame, and a quiet orphan girl with no family, no connections, no one in the world to speak up for her. Well, that was the easiest target there was. The injustice of it sat in her gut like a swallowed stone, cold, hard, unmoving. She had been given her final wages, $10, and told to be gone by morning. The housekeeper had not even looked at her when she said it, just kept polishing the silver as if Marjorie were already a ghost. And maybe she was. Now, standing on a plank sidewalk in a town she had never seen before, her worn carpet bag in one hand and the sum total of her earthly worth folded into a handkerchief in her pocket, she felt as insignificant as a single grain of dust in the vast, indifferent sweep of the Sawtooth Range that loomed over the rooftops like a judgment carved in granite. Men on horseback clattered past, their faces leathered by sun and wind, not one of them giving her a second glance. A woman in a calico bonnet hurried by with 2 children in tow and looked right through her as if she were made of glass, invisible. An orphan raised by the state, a servant raised by strangers, a girl whose name appeared on no one's Christmas list and in no one's prayers. She had spent 21 years on this earth and left no more impression on it than a footprint in running water. Her $10 would not last a week at the boarding house. She could see the sign from where she stood. $2 a night, meals extra. She did the arithmetic in her head. 5 nights. Then what? Beg for kitchen work at the saloon. Scrub someone else's floors until some other porcelain pitcher found a reason to shatter itself in her direction. No, something in her chest. Some stubborn, reckless, probably foolish thing that had kept her breathing through every cold night and every closed door of her life. That thing said no. She needed a place, any place, a place that belonged to her and no one else, a place where she could not be dismissed. That is what led her to the Territorial Land Office. It was a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale tobacco and dry paper. A clerk sat behind a high counter. Green eyeshade, ink-stained fingers. A ledger open before him, the size of a family Bible. His name was Mr. Tully, and when he looked up at her, his expression carried the weary patience of a man who had run out of good answers years ago. Before she could speak, a voice boomed from the corner of the room. "Well, well, look what the stage coughed up." She turned. A man was leaning back in a wooden chair near the window, thumbs hooked in a brocade waistcoat that strained across his belly. He was perhaps 50, thick through the shoulders, a face like a side of beef that someone had tried to make handsome with a waxed mustache and a gold watch chain. His name was Boone Eckhart, and Marjorie would come to learn that he was the closest thing Ketchum had to a king, a land speculator who bought and sold claims the way other men traded horses. With a predator's glee and a predator's patience, he appraised her, head to toe, the way a man appraises a horse he has already decided not to buy. Lost little Lady Marjorie turned back to the clerk. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the counter to stop it. "I am looking to buy a piece of land." Her voice came out softer than she intended. "Something small, something cheap." Eckhart laughed, a harsh barking sound that bounced off the low ceiling. "Cheap? Honey, the only thing cheap around here is talk. And you are getting mine for free." Mr. Tully gave Eckhart a sidelong glare that said he had heard enough of the man's commentary to last several lifetimes. Then he turned back to Marjorie. "Not much available for a small purse, miss. Most everything worth having has been claimed for mining or timber." He paused, his long finger tapping on a large rolled map at the edge of the counter. "There is one thing, a trapper's plot up in the East Fork Basin. Has a cabin on it, or so the deed says. Nobody has laid eyes on it in near on 10 years. Something shifted in Marjorie's chest. A flutter, like a bird trapped behind her ribs. The man who owned it, name of Josiah Renwick, just vanished, Tully said. Went into the mountains one fall and never came out. The territory repossessed the land for back taxes. He shrugged. It is the cheapest thing on the books. How much? $2. The silence that followed was enormous. Marjorie could hear the tick of the clock on the wall, the creak of Eckhart's chair as he leaned forward, the sound of her own blood beating in her ears. $2 for a pile of rock and grizzly bears for neighbors, Eckhart said. He was grinning now, a wide, wet grin that showed his back teeth. That cabin is likely nothing but a stain on the ground, if it ever existed at all. But Marjorie heard something else in the description. She heard solitude. She heard a place so forgotten that no one would bother her. A place so worthless that no one would try to take it from her. She heard silence, and silence was the one thing she had always been able to survive. I will take it. Her voice found a sudden firmness that surprised even her. She opened her purse and laid $2 silver on the counter. They shone dully in the lamplight. 2 small moons. The sound they made when they touched the wood was the heaviest, most final sound she had ever heard in her life. Because that sound was the sound of a door closing on one life and another one, God help her, creaking open. The transaction took less than 10 minutes. The paperwork was a single sheet of brittle paper. The clerk wrote her name in his careful hand. Marjorie Slade, landowner. The words looked foreign, impossible, like a sentence in a language she had not yet learned to speak. Boone Eckhart watched the whole affair from his corner chair. His grin had curdled into something colder, less amusement, more calculation. You will be back before the first snow, he said, begging for work, begging for a bed. That mountain eats people like you for breakfast. Marjorie folded the deed, placed it carefully in her bag. Then she met his gaze. One silent moment, giving him nothing, and turned and walked out of the office without a word. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. She heard his chair scrape back hard against the floor as the door swung shut behind her. Good. Let him be angry. Angry men make mistakes. She did not know why that thought came to her, but it did, and she held on to it. With her remaining $8, Marjorie went not to the mercantile for supplies, but to the livery stable at the far end of the main street. She needed something more important than flour or coffee. She needed a way to carry her life up a mountain. The livery was a dim, dusty barn that smelled of hay and horse sweat, and the honest, uncomplicated musk of animals who did not care about deeds or dollars. A man named Pruitt ran it. He was thin as a fence rail with a tobacco-stained beard and an economy of speech that Marjorie appreciated immediately. In a back pen, standing alone, was a mule the color of a dusty mouse. He was old. One ear flopped over permanently. The other stood up like a sentinel. He regarded Marjorie with an expression that said he had seen every variety of human foolishness the territory had to offer, and expected no good to come of any of it. That one is $5, Pruitt said. He is stubborn, but he is sure-footed. Name is Solomon. Marjorie looked at the mule. The mule looked at Marjorie. Something passed between them. Some wordless recognition between two creatures the world had written off. She paid the $5, leaving her with $3 for flour, salt, coffee, an axe, and a length of rope. She loaded her new companion with her few possessions. Solomon accepted the burden with a long, mournful sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his ancient soul, as if to say, I have seen this kind of thing before, and it never ends well. But fine, let us go. As she led him through the main street of Ketchum, the town watched. Faces appeared in windows. Men paused on the saloon porch. Their whispers followed her like a swarm of flies. The fool girl who bought the ghost's cabin. What did she think she was going to do up there? How long before she starved? Froze, got eaten. Did she even know which end of an axe to hold? Boone Eckhart had come out onto the saloon porch, a whiskey glass catching the late afternoon light in his thick hand. A toast! He shouted to the men gathered around him. To the Queen of Renwick's ruin, may her reign be short and her return swift. Laughter. A ragged, cruel sound that followed her up the trail like dogs nipping at her heels. Marjorie kept her eyes on the jagged line of the peaks ahead. Her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. Their mockery was just another kind of weather, something to be endured. She had her deed. She had her mule. She had a direction. It was more than she had yesterday. What she did not see, what she could not have known, was what happened in the land office after she left. Boone Eckhart did not stay on the saloon porch long. The laughter was for show. The whiskey was for show. The moment Marjorie's figure disappeared around the bend in the trail, he set down his glass and walked back inside to the counter where Mr. Tully was filing the deed. Eckhart's face was no longer amused. It was tight, focused, the face of a man doing arithmetic he did not like. That Renwick plot, he said, his voice low. What else is in the file? Tully looked up, nervous now. Not much, Mr. Eckhart. Just the deed and the tax record. The man vanished 10 years ago. Nobody ever came looking for his things. Nobody. Eckhart repeated. He drummed his thick fingers on the counter. Then he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You remember my father, Eldon Eckhart. He had business with Renwick once, a long time ago, before the old man disappeared. Tully swallowed hard. I would not know about that, sir. No. Eckhart straightened up. You would not. He adjusted his watch chain. Where is the livery man? I want to know what direction she took. Which trail? He walked out into the fading light. A man with a purpose he had not yet explained to anyone, and no intention of explaining it. The girl was nothing, a dismissed servant with a mule. But that cabin, that name, Josiah Renwick. That name had lived in the Eckhart family like a splinter under the skin for a very long time. And splinters, if you leave them alone, have a way of working themselves deeper. The trail was little more than a game track, a suggestion of a path that faded in and out of existence like a rumor. For 4 days, Marjorie and Solomon climbed, leaving the world of men and their judgments far below. The air grew thin, sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and cold stone and something older that had no name. The scale of the landscape was humbling in a way that words could barely touch. Great granite-faced mountains clawed at a sky of impossible blue. Valleys opened up beneath them, vast and green and empty. Rivers threaded through them like veins of silver. Marjorie felt her own smallness, but for the first time in her life, it was not a source of shame. Out here, everyone was small. The mountains did not care if you were rich or poor, servant or master, orphan or heir. They simply were. Enormous and ancient and utterly indifferent to the brief dramas of human life. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk riding the thermals above a distant ridge, the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, and the steady rhythmic plod of Solomon's hooves on the rocky ground. The mule was proving his worth 10 times over. He navigated treacherous scree slopes and narrow ledges with a calm, determined patience that Marjorie found herself trying to copy. His occasional soft snort or the flick of his one good ear was all the conversation she needed. They were alike. 2 discarded creatures finding purpose in a place no one else wanted. On the morning of the 4th day, she found it. The cabin was tucked into a small meadow beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. But it was worse than she had imagined. So much worse. Eckhart's laughter rang in her memory. It was not a cabin so much as the memory of one. The roof had collapsed in the middle, sagging like the spine of a dying animal. The single door hung from one leather hinge, gaping open to the darkness within. The log walls were gray and weathered. The chinking crumbled away, leaving gaps you could put a fist through. Weeds and wild raspberry canes grew thick around the foundation, pulling it back into the earth. Disappointment hit her cold and sharp as the creek water. For a dizzying, terrible moment, she felt the full, crushing weight of what she had done. She had traded her last dollars for a ruin, a tomb. The townspeople were right. Eckhart was right. She was a fool standing at the edge of nowhere holding a piece of paper that meant nothing. She sat down on a fallen log, put her face in her hands, and for the first time since leaving Boise, she cried. Not the polite, quiet tears of a servant who knows she cannot be heard, but deep, ugly sobs that shook her whole body and sent Solomon backing away with his ears flat. She cried for 10 minutes, maybe 15, and then she stopped. Because the creek was still running, the meadow grass was still green, the sky was still blue, and the mountains were still there. Patient, indifferent, waiting. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood up, looked at the ruin. "Well," she said to Solomon, "it is not going to fix itself." The mule flicked his one good ear forward, which she chose to interpret as agreement. She tethered him in the meadow where the grass was good and walked slowly toward the broken structure. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, damp earth and mouse nests and time itself. A pack rat had built a fortress in one corner. The floor was littered with debris, the stone fireplace black and silent. It was a place of profound and utter abandonment. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly why it was hers. The next morning, Marjorie began to work. There was no grand plan, no strategy, just a simple dogged refusal to surrender. She started by evicting the pack rat, which turned out to be less a task and more a small war. The creature was roughly the size of a house cat, twice as angry and absolutely certain of its legal claim to the premises. It took a long stick, a great deal of shouting, and one undignified moment where Marjorie tripped over her own feet and landed face first in a pile of pine needles. Solomon watched the whole spectacle from the meadow, with his ears pricked forward and his lips curled back over his teeth in what she could have sworn was a grin. Then came the sweeping. She used a pine bough to clear away years of accumulated dirt and leaves and droppings. Underneath the debris, the puncheon floor was mostly solid, the split logs worn smooth by a solitary man's footsteps. Each plank a record of years spent walking the same small room. Alone, she dragged out the broken furniture, a three-legged stool, a collapsed cot, set them in the sun. And then she kept going. Every bucket of clean water she hauled from the creek, every armful of debris she cleared, every cobweb she swept from the corners. Each small act felt like a declaration. I am here. I am staying. Her hands, softened by years of domestic work, were raw and blistered by the end of the first day. Her back ached in places she did not know had muscles, but she did not stop. She could not stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant calculating how many days of flower she had left, how many weeks until the first snow, how many miles between her and the nearest human being who might care if she lived or died. So she did not think. She worked. Solomon became her shadow. He followed her to the creek, stood patiently as she dug clay from the bank, dozed in the sun as she mixed it with dry grass and pressed the thick paste into the gaps between the logs. She talked to him, not expecting answers, just needing to hear a voice break the enormous silence. She told him about Boise, about the broken pitcher, about Boone Eckhart's cruel toast. The mule listened, his one good ear cocked in her direction, occasionally nudging her arm with his soft nose. She spent 2 days patching the roof, using fallen bark and pine boughs and thick squares of sod cut from the meadow. Clumsy, ugly work. But it would keep out the worst of the rain. She rehung the door using leather straps cut from a piece of her own luggage. It swung shut with a satisfying thud that echoed in the small space. The interior was still dark, still rough, but it was enclosed. It was a room. It was hers, and then, on the 3rd day of labor, she found the stone. She had turned her attention to the fireplace. It was a solid, well-built structure of river stone, the one thing in the cabin that spoke of real craftsmanship. As she swept out the cold, packed ash from the hearth, her hand brushed against one of the flat stones that formed the apron in front of the firebox. It shifted, just a fraction, a tiny movement that most people would never have noticed. But Marjorie's life had been one of noticing small things. A misplaced teacup, a speck of dust on a polished table. The subtle shift in a mistress's tone that meant trouble was coming. Her survival had always depended on seeing what others missed. She pushed the stone again. It rocked. The mortar around it was a slightly different color than the rest. Thinner. Applied later. She knelt, ran her fingers around its edge, her heart beginning to beat in a way that had nothing to do with the labor. It was probably nothing. A poorly laid stone, a gap where a mouse had nested. Except, a man who could build a fireplace this well did not lay stones poorly. A man who chose to live alone in the wilderness for years did not make careless mistakes with mortar. Everything in this cabin, every joint, every notch, every carefully fitted log, spoke of deliberation, of patience, of a mind that did nothing by accident. She went to her pack and pulled out the small pry bar. The fire she had built cast flickering shadows on the wall as she worked the tip of the bar into the thin seam. The mortar resisted. She put her weight into it, arms trembling. Then, with a soft, scraping sound, it gave way. She worked around the stone, chipping, prying, her breath coming fast now. The stone lifted, heavy and slick with soot. She tilted it aside and looked down. A hollow, about a foot square and 6 inches deep, lined with a carefully folded piece of oilcloth to keep out the damp, and nestled inside, protected by the cloth, were 2 things. The first was a tightly rolled cylinder of scraped deerskin tied with a leather thong. The second was a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, written in a hand that was precise and elegant. She reached for the paper, unfolded it with trembling fingers, held it to the firelight. 7 words. They killed for this once. They will again. The air in the cabin changed. The shadows deepened. The fire popped, and she flinched as if she had been struck. She read it again and again. The words did not change. They sat on the paper, stark, final. A dead man's warning delivered across 10 years of silence. Her hands were shaking as she reached back into the hollow and lifted out the deerskin roll. She untied the thong, slowly, carefully, unrolled it on the floor in the firelight. It was a map, drawn with charcoal and some kind of berry ink. The lines stark against the pale, creamy surface of the hide. It was beautiful, a work of patient artistry that must have taken weeks. It showed the valley she was in, her cabin marked with a small, careful drawing of a smoking chimney. But it also showed the terrain beyond. Terrain she had never seen. A waterfall that split in two. A ridge shaped like a sleeping giant. A single lightning-scarred pine on a high pass. And 3 valleys to the east, deeper and higher into the wilderness. An X. Beside it, a drawing of another cabin, this one seemingly nestled against a sheer cliff face. No words, no explanation, just the trail and the destination, and that warning. Marjorie sat on the floor of Josiah Renwick's cabin, the map in her lap, the note in her hand, the fire dying to embers. She should burn it, both of them. Forget she ever found them. Seal the stone back in place and live her quiet life in this valley, and never think about what a dead man had hidden or why. That was the safe thing, the sensible thing. But safe and sensible were the words of a world that had already thrown her away. And Marjorie Slade, for the first time in her 21 years, found that she was very tired of being safe. She did not sleep that night. Now here is where things need to slow down for a moment. Because what Marjorie did next was not what a smart woman would do. It was what a brave one would do. And sometimes those are very different things. What do you think she should have done? Let us know in the comments. And if you have not yet subscribed, make sure you do. Because the trail she is about to follow goes to places neither she nor we could have imagined. She hesitated for 2 days. The map sat on the table. The warning sat beside it. She would look at them while she ate her spare meals. Look at them while she drank her coffee in the cold, sharp mornings. Look at them while Solomon watched her from the meadow with his one good ear cocked as if waiting for a decision. The journey looked perilous. The map showed a route that crossed high exposed ridges and descended into steep unknown canyons. Winter was coming. The nights already bit with frost. To leave the safety of her repaired cabin and venture deeper into the wilderness felt like an act of pure madness. But the map felt like a promise. Josiah Renwick had not been a fool. The careful construction of the cabin, the clever hiding place, the beautifully rendered map. It all spoke of a deliberate, thoughtful mind, a mind that planned, that tested, that did not waste effort on empty gestures. This was not a whim, it was an invitation, and the warning, strangely, made her trust it more, not less. Because a man who warns you of danger is a man who cares whether you survive it. On the third morning, she packed enough supplies for a week, loaded the patient Solomon, tucked the deerskin map inside her coat, against her skin, where she could feel its weight with every step, and followed the ghost's trail east. The landmarks were real, but finding them required a constant wearying attention to the landscape that left her drained by nightfall. The lightning-scarred pine guided her across a wind-blasted pass where the air was so thin it hurt to breathe. The sleeping giant ridge forced her to lead Solomon along a narrow ledge with nothing but 1,000 feet of empty air on one side and cold gray stone on the other. The mule never faltered, placing his hooves with an innate stubborn wisdom that she tried to match with every careful step of her own. On the evening of the third day, she found the second cabin. It was exactly where the map had placed it, tucked into an alcove at the base of a massive granite cliff, almost invisible until you were right upon it. And it was in far better condition than the first. Solid oak door, oiled paper windows, sound roof, but the door was locked, not with a common latch or a padlock, with something else, a wooden mechanism built into the frame itself. A series of pegs that had to be pressed in a specific sequence. Marjorie studied it for a long moment. Then she looked at the map again. There, in the corner, so small she had almost missed it. A sequence of tiny symbols, dots and dashes, hidden in the decorative border. She pressed the pegs in order. The door swung open with a soft click. Renwick, you clever man. Inside, spare but immaculate. A bed with a folded wool blanket, a small stove, a single chair and table, untouched. As if the owner had simply walked out for an afternoon stroll and never returned. And there, laid squarely in the center of the table, was another map. This one was drawn on a large piece of canvas, weighted down at the corners with smooth river stones, even more detailed than the first. It showed the path she had just taken, and then continued on, pushing deeper into a region of sharp, unforgiving peaks. But this map was different. It showed two routes forward. The first was drawn in bold, clear lines, easy to follow. A wide valley leading south through gentle terrain toward the destination marked with another X. The second was almost invisible, drawn in faint, thin lines that blended into the texture of the canvas itself. It went north, through what appeared to be a brutal stretch of terrain, a gorge, a descent that looked more like a controlled fall than a hike. Most people would have taken the clear route, the obvious route, the easy one. But Marjorie sat at Renwick's table and stared at that map for a very long time, and something nagged at her, a detail, a pattern. The first map, the one hidden under the hearthstone, had also been a kind of test, hidden where only a careful, observant person would find it, protected by a mechanism that required patience and attention to decode. Renwick had designed everything as a filter, each step harder than the last, each step requiring more care, more thought, more willingness to look past the obvious. So why would the final leg of his trail be easy? Why would the last map point down a wide, clear valley when every other step had been a puzzle? Unless the easy path was not the path at all, unless it was a trap, a dead end designed to turn back anyone who had gotten this far on luck rather than understanding. Marjorie pulled the canvas close, studied the faint lines of the hidden route. They were there, deliberately faint, deliberately difficult, made for someone willing to see what was hard to see. She traced the faint line with her finger, north, into the gorge, through the worst terrain on the map, and there at the end of it, almost invisible, a third X, a third cabin. She chose the hard way, because by now she understood something about the man who had drawn these maps. He did not trust the obvious. He did not trust the easy. He trusted patience and care, and the willingness to endure difficulty in pursuit of truth. She understood him because she was the same. That night, she slept in Renwick's second cabin, the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Solomon sheltered in a lean-to behind the structure. The wind sang through the high passes above, and the stars burned white and fierce through the oiled paper windows. She was deeper in the wilderness than any woman she had ever heard of. Deeper than most men would dare. And tomorrow she would go deeper still. She should have been terrified, and part of her was. A small, cold knot of fear sat in the pit of her stomach. But larger than the fear was something else. Purpose. For the first time in her life, she was not running away from something. She was running toward it. In the pale gray light before dawn, she rose, packed her things, loaded Solomon, checked the map one final time, and then she saw them. Boot prints in the soft mud just outside the cabin door. Fresh, the edges still sharp. Not her boots, not her prints. Larger, heavier. A man's stride. And the door. She looked at it again in the morning light. The wooden pegs of Renwick's locking mechanism. Someone had tried them. In the wrong order. There were scratch marks on the wood. Gouges where a knife had been used to try to pry the mechanism apart. Someone had been here. Someone who had followed her trail through the mountains. Someone who had arrived at this cabin, tried to get in, failed, and was still out there. Marjorie's blood went cold. She pressed her back against the cabin wall and scanned the tree line. The forest was silent, still. Nothing moved except the creek and the wind. But the prints were fresh, hours old, maybe less. They killed for this once. They will again. She looked down at the deerskin map pressed against her chest. She looked at the faint, hidden trail leading north into the gorge. She looked at the bold, clear trail leading south. The easy way, the obvious way. And she understood with a sudden, horrible clarity exactly what Renwick's trap was for. Whoever was following her would see the same two paths she had seen. And they would take the easy one, the bold one, the obvious one, because they were not patient. They were not careful. They were the kind of people Renwick had spent his whole life hiding from. The trap was not for her. It was for them. Marjorie Slade took a breath, shouldered her pack, took Solomon's lead rope in her blistered hand, and walked north, into the gorge, into the hard way. Behind her, the boot prints pointed south. The descent into the gorge was not a hike. It was a negotiation with gravity. A long, brutal argument between Marjorie's body and the mountain itself. And the mountain was winning. The hidden trail Renwick had drawn in those faint, thin lines turned out to be a series of switchbacks carved into a near vertical rock face, barely wide enough for Solomon to pass. Loose stone shifting underfoot with every step, sending cascades of gravel rattling down into the darkness below, where a river roared somewhere unseen. A sound like a living thing, hungry and patient. Marjorie led the mule by his rope, one hand on the rock wall, one hand on the leather, both hands bleeding from the cold and the stone. She did not look down. She had made that mistake once, about 100 yards back, when a ledge gave way beneath her left boot, and for one perfect crystalline second, she was standing on nothing, just air, just the long, empty drop and the sound of the river. Solomon had saved her. his teeth closing on the back of her coat, hauling her backward onto solid ground with a grunt of effort and a snort that needed no translation. If you die, I am stuck on this ledge forever. So kindly watch your step. She did not look down again. The descent took most of the day. By the time they reached the bottom, her legs were shaking so badly she had to sit on a boulder for 20 minutes before she could stand again. Her fingernails were cracked. Her knees were skinned through her dress. She had torn a long strip from the hem of her coat on a jutting branch, and her hair had come loose from its pins and hung around her face like a wild woman. But the gorge was worth it. It opened up before her like a cathedral. The walls rose 1,000 feet on either side. Sheer granite faces streaked with bands of rose and gold and deep iron red. A river ran through the center of it, not the angry, roaring thing she had heard from above. Down here, it was wide and slow and clear, moving with a dignity that predated the first human breath. And the trees, aspens, hundreds of them, their leaves had turned with the coming cold, a brilliant shimmering gold that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back in every direction. So bright it hurt to look at. The air itself seemed to glow. Marjorie stood in the middle of it, the reins slack in her hand, Solomon beside her, both of them perfectly still. She had never seen anything this beautiful. She had not known anything this beautiful existed. For a long moment, she forgot about the map, the warning, the boot prints at the second cabin. She forgot about Boone Eckhart and the town of Ketchum and every cruel laughter she had ever walked past. She forgot the broken pitcher and the woman who had cast her out. She forgot everything because the world had a room like this hidden inside it, and it had been waiting for her. She found the third cabin in a grove of aspens at the base of the southern cliff wall, and the word cabin did not fit. It was a home built of massive hand-hewn logs fitted together with a precision that spoke of years of careful, patient work. A stone porch faced the rising sun. The roof was sound. The windows had glass, real glass, carried God knows how many miles on God knows whose back into this impossible place. And behind the structure, piped through a clever system of hollowed logs and stone channels, a natural hot spring fed into a lined bathing pool. Steam curled from its surface in the cold air, drifting up through the golden leaves like the breath of the earth itself. The door was unlocked, a final gesture of trust from a man who had spent 20 years testing everyone who might follow his trail. If you made it this far, you had earned the right to enter. She pushed it open. The air inside was cool and dry, smelling of cedar and beeswax and old paper. One great room with a stone fireplace that could have warmed a church. A bed built into the wall with a mattress stuffed with sweet grass. A kitchen area with a stove. Shelves on every wall holding not just tins of preserved food and supplies, but books. dozens of them. Poetry, philosophy, geology, botany. A library carried into the wilderness, one volume at a time, over 2 decades. A sturdy workbench stood in one corner, covered with finely made tools for surveying and map making. Compasses, protractors, straight edges, bottles of ink in colors she had never seen, all arranged with a surgeon's precision. And in the center of the room, on a massive table made from a single slab of pine sanded smooth as silk, sat a thick leather-bound ledger, easily 3 inches thick, closed, waiting. Marjorie collapsed into the chair, her hands on the table, flat, trembling. She stared at the ledger the way a person stares at a closed door that might lead to paradise or ruin. And there was no way to know which until you opened it. She opened it. The pages were not filled with words. They were filled with maps. Dozens upon dozens of them executed with a skill that made her breath catch. These were not rough sketches. They were masterworks. The kind of maps that belonged in government offices or university libraries. Josiah Renwick had not been just a trapper. He had been a cartographer, a geographer, a scientist of the wilderness for 20 years, working alone, with instruments he had made or carried in himself. He had systematically and secretly mapped the entire Sawtooth Range, every ridge, every valley, every creek and spring and mineral vein. His notes in the margins detailed water tables, timber quality, soil composition, the location of mineral deposits. It was the life's work of a genius, a complete and perfect survey of a vast uncharted territory, done by one man, alone, in silence. And then, tucked into a sleeve in the back cover, she found a small, heavy tin box. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp. Inside, nestled on a bed of raw wool, was a doeskin pouch. She untied it, poured the contents onto the table. Gold. A river of gold dust and small, heavy nuggets cascading out into the candlelight. Gleaming, warm, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with what gold means to a woman who owns nothing, who has been told her entire life that she is worth nothing. She stared at it, her mind refusing to calculate. Because if she let herself believe this was real, and then it turned out to be a dream, she would not survive the waking. Beneath the gold was one final folded letter. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was the same as the notes on the maps. Careful, elegant. To the one who arrives. If you are reading this, you have proven yourself possessed of the one quality I have come to value above all others in my years of solitude: patience. You have not sought to conquer this land. You have listened to it, followed its trails, read its signs, solved its puzzles, not with force or haste, but with care. I have no heir of my blood, no wife, no child. I chose the mountains over the company of men many years ago, and I do not regret that choice. But I am old now, and the cold gets into my bones in ways it did not before. I feel the end of my trail approaching, so I leave my work and my wealth to the one with the wit and the patience to follow my path. The gold is yours. It will provide a beginning, but the maps are the true treasure. They show what is, not what men in faraway offices have guessed to be. The boundary of this territory is wrong. The survey of 1863 drew the line a full 10 miles west of where it should be. The valley of this cabin and all the timber and grazing land to the east of it legally belongs to no one. It is unclaimed, untitled, waiting for the one with the knowledge to prove the error and file the rightful claim. Use this work wisely. Do not let the greedy ones have it. This land does not wish to be owned, only to be stewarded. I built this place for no one, but I leave it for you, whoever you are. Josiah Renwick. Marjorie read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it, pressed it against her chest, and sat perfectly still in the chair of a man who had been dead for 10 years. A man she had never met, who had trusted her with everything he had, without ever knowing her name. She looked from the gold to the maps to the letter, and the word that came to her mind was not fortune or treasure. The word was responsibility. Because Josiah Renwick had not left her a gift, he had left her a test. One final test, harder than the hearthstone, harder than the locked door, harder than the hidden path. He was asking her what she would do with power, what she would do with knowledge that other men would kill for. Marjorie spent 2 days in the 3rd cabin reading Renwick's journals. They were separate from the survey ledger, stored in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. He wrote the way he mapped, with precision, with beauty, with a lonely eloquence that made her chest ache. He wrote of the geology, the way the granite folded and faulted, the ancient rivers that had carved these canyons over millions of years. He wrote of the seasons, the first snow that silenced the world, the spring melt that made it roar again. He wrote of the elk, the wolves, the great silent owls that hunted the gorge at dusk. And he wrote of the men who wanted what he had found. A land agent in Ketchum, he wrote, a man named Eckhart, has learned that the boundary line is wrong, not from my work, from his own crude surveying. He knows the land beyond the line is unclaimed, and he knows it is rich. He came to my first cabin once, years ago, with 2 men and a proposition. Sell him the maps. Show him where the mineral deposits are. Split the profits. I refused. He did not take the refusal well. One of his men put a knife to my throat. I showed them nothing. They left. But Eckhart promised he would return, that he would find what I had hidden with or without my help. He was wrong about that last part. The mountains have protected me very well, but I am not young anymore, and when I am gone, the maps will be unguarded. That is why I built the trail, the tests, the locks, the hidden paths, not to hide the truth forever, but to ensure it falls into the right hands. Marjorie closed the journal, her mind racing. Eckhart, not Boone, his father, Eldon Eckhart, the man Boone had mentioned to Tully in the land office. My father had business with Renwick once. Business, a knife to the throat and a demand for maps. That was what he called business. And now the son was finishing what the father had started. That was why Boone had watched her buy the cabin with those calculating eyes. That was why he had asked Tully which direction she went. That was why there were boot prints at the second cabin. Boone Eckhart had sent someone after her, and that someone had taken the wrong path. The trap. But traps only work once. And Boone Eckhart did not seem like a man who gave up after one failure. She could not stay here. She had to move, file the claim, make it legal, before Boone found another way in. But she was not going to carry everything out at once. The ledger, the gold, the journals. If she lost it all in one river crossing or one wrong step on a narrow ledge, then Renwick's legacy died with her. So she did something that changed everything. She divided the ledger. She sat at Renwick's table with a candle burning low and carefully, methodically separated the pages into 2 groups. The first contained the general survey data. Beautiful work, impressive to any cartographer, but not the key evidence. The second group, smaller, maybe 30 pages, contained the critical material. The measurements that proved the boundary line was wrong. The specific coordinates, the calculations, the margin notes that referenced the 1863 survey by name and identified exactly where and how it had erred. She wrapped the second group in oilcloth, tucked it inside her coat, against her skin. The first group she left in the ledger, on the table, along with the gold, along with the journals. If someone found this cabin and stole everything in it, they would have Renwick's beautiful maps, his gold, his story. But they would not have the proof, the 30 pages that could redraw the boundary of a territory. Those pages went where Marjorie went. She made this decision at 2 a.m. by the light of a single candle, with Solomon snoring softly in the lean-to outside. And she made it not because she was clever, but because she had read Renwick's warning, and she had learned in 21 years of being powerless that the only things you truly own
are the things you carry with you. She planned to leave at first light, retrieve the gold and the remaining ledger on a second trip, however many it took.
But the mountains had other plans. The weather turned in the night. The sky that had been clear and studded with stars went gray, then heavy, then the color of iron. A strange silence fell over the gorge. The birds stopped singing. The river seemed to hush. Even the wind died to an expectant stillness, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then the snow began. It started gentle, soft flakes drifting down through the golden aspens like feathers from a torn pillow. Marjorie stood on the stone porch and watched them fall and thought, "This is not so bad. This will pass." It did not pass. Within an hour, the gentle flakes had become a wall of white, a blinding, furious blizzard that screamed through the gorge. The wind hit the cabin so hard the door shook in its frame. Drifts began to pile against the walls, climbing 2 feet, 4 feet, burying the windows on the north side. Marjorie brought Solomon into the lean-to, fed him from Renwick's stores, stoked the fire, cooked venison broth from dried meat she found in the larder, and she waited. For 3 days the world vanished. 3 days of wind that never stopped. Snow that never stopped. A cold so deep it seemed to seep through the walls despite the fire. Marjorie wore every piece of clothing she owned and still shivered. She pored over Renwick's maps by firelight, memorizing, studying, committing the landscape to the archive inside her head, where no one could steal it. On the 4th morning, the wind died. Not gradually. It just stopped, as if someone had closed a door. The silence that followed was so total that Marjorie thought for a moment she had gone deaf. She scraped frost from the one window that was not buried, pressed her face to the glass, and saw him. A dark shape struggling through the drifts. 50 yards from the cabin, maybe less. Stumbling, falling, getting up, falling again. Moving with the desperate, graceless flailing of a creature at the very end of its strength. A man. He collapsed face first into the snow and did not get up. Marjorie did not think. She pulled on Renwick's heavy winter coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, grabbed the rope from her pack, and plunged out into the storm's aftermath. The snow was waist deep. Every step was a fight. The cold stole her breath, burned her face, turned her fingers numb inside her gloves within seconds. She reached him, nearly buried. A young man, maybe 30, gaunt, bearded, his face pale as the snow around him, his lips blue, one hand still gripping a prospector's pickaxe in a frozen death grip, his clothes soaked through and crusted with ice. She got the rope around his chest, under his arms, and began to drag. It took her the better part of an hour. 60 minutes of pulling and hauling and falling and cursing and getting up and pulling again. Her muscles screaming, her lungs burning. Inside, she stripped off his frozen clothes, wrapped him in every blanket the cabin held, laid him near the fire, thawed his frozen hands and feet in lukewarm water. A slow, agonizing process. Warm water, not hot, never hot. The flesh had to come back slowly, or it would die. He was delirious, muttering through cracked blue lips. Fragments of words, a lost claim, a partner, snow, so much snow. He would reach out and grab her wrist with surprising strength, then let go, then reach out again, lost in some fever landscape where she was the only solid thing. For 2 days she nursed him, spoon-fed him warm broth, changed his bandages, kept the fire high, talked to him in a low, steady voice, even though she did not know if he could hear her. On the morning of the 3rd day, he opened his eyes. They were gray, pale gray, like river stones. They moved slowly around the cabin, taking in the shelves of books, the maps on the table, the fireplace, and finally, Marjorie, sitting in the chair beside his bed, dark circles under her eyes, her hands raw and chapped.
"You saved my life." His voice was a rasp, a sound scraped from the bottom of an empty well. "You are not dead yet," Marjorie said, "so let us not celebrate too early."
His name was Garrett Nye. He was a prospector, or so he said. He and a partner had been working a claim in the high country when the blizzard hit. They got separated. His partner went south. He went north, into the gorge, stumbling blind for 3 days until his body gave out. He told the story in pieces, between sips of broth, between long stretches of exhausted silence, and Marjorie listened, studied him the way she had once studied the faces of her employers, looking for the tells, the tiny shifts in expression that separated truth from performance. He seemed genuine, grateful, humbled the way a man gets when he has stared at death and been surprised to find himself still breathing. He asked almost nothing about her, how she had come to be in this remarkable cabin. He seemed content simply to be alive, and Marjorie, against her better judgment, against the cold voice in her head that whispered, "Trust no one," found herself warming to him. Because loneliness is a kind of hunger, and she had been hungry for a very long time. Over the next several days, as the snow settled and the trails grew passable, a quiet friendship formed between them. Garrett was useful. He repaired a section of the lean-to roof that had buckled under the snow. He split firewood with an efficiency that spoke of years of hard living. He was quiet, respectful. He did not try to charm her or flatter her. He simply worked alongside her. And at night by the fire, he told stories of his prospecting days in Montana and Colorado. Stories that were modest and self-deprecating and occasionally funny. And Marjorie, slowly, carefully, told him about Renwick. Not everything, not the gold, not the letter, not the 30 critical pages tucked inside her coat. But she showed him the ledger, the general maps, the beautiful, meticulous survey of the Sawtooth Range. She watched his face as he turned the pages, and she saw what she had felt: wonder, admiration, awe. "This man was a genius," Garrett said, his finger tracing the contour lines of a mountain ridge. "This is better work than anything the government ever produced." Marjorie nodded. She felt a flush of pride, as if Renwick's achievement were her own. That was her mistake, not showing him the maps. She had been careful about that. Only the general pages. Only the beautiful but not critical survey data. Her mistake was the pride, the warmth, the simple human pleasure of sharing something extraordinary with another person after weeks of silence. She let her guard down. Not all the way, but enough. Enough for Garrett Nye to know that there was more. Because he was watching her too. It happened on the 7th night. Marjorie woke in the dark. Not because of a sound, because of the absence of one. The fire had burned low. The cabin was cold, and the space on the floor where Garrett slept was empty. She sat up, her heart already hammering, her hand going automatically to the inside of her coat. The oilcloth packet, still there, still sealed. But the ledger. The ledger was open on the table, and Garrett was bent over it. Not reading, writing. He had a stub of pencil in his hand and a piece of paper, and he was copying. Quickly, methodically, page after page, his face tight with concentration. The world went very still. The fire popped, a log shifted, and Marjorie heard something break inside her chest. A small sound, quiet, the way a green branch snaps when you bend it past its limit. She stood up, walked to the table, laid her hand flat on the page he was copying. He froze. His pencil stopped. He did not look up. He stared at her hand on the paper, and she watched shame move across his face like a shadow. Put the pencil down. He put it down. Tell me. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to empty him. Then he looked at her, and his gray eyes were the eyes of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. Eckhart, he said. Boone Eckhart hired me before you even left Ketchum. He paid me $50 to follow you into the mountains and find out what Renwick had hidden. The words landed one at a time. I followed you from town, Garrett said. Stayed a day behind, found the second cabin, tried to get in. Could not figure the lock. The boot prints, Marjorie whispered. That was me. He nodded. When you went north, I went south. The clear trail. The one that looked right. The trap. It was not a trap, exactly. It was just nothing. A dead-end valley. No cabin. No maps. I wandered for 2 days trying to find another way in. Then the blizzard hit, and I nearly died. For real. He paused, his jaw working. When you pulled me out of that snow, that was not part of the plan. I was supposed to find you and steal whatever you found. But you found me instead, half dead, and you saved me. You did not have to. Marjorie said nothing, her hand still flat on the page. I should have told you then, the first night, when I opened my eyes and you were sitting there. I should have told you everything. But you did not. No. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Solomon shifted in the lean-to. A soft thump of hooves on straw. How much did he pay you? $50, plus a share of whatever the maps turned out to be worth. $50. Half a year's wages for a servant girl. That was the price. Garrett flinched. I know what it sounds like. It sounds exactly like what it is. She pulled the copied pages toward her. He had been thorough. Most of the general survey data, the topographical details. Enough for Boone Eckhart to know that Renwick's work was real. Enough to whet his appetite. But not the boundary calculations, not the proof, because those pages were inside her coat, where they had been since the night she divided the ledger, the night some instinct she could not name had told her to separate the treasure from the bait. Get out, she said. Marjorie. Take your boots, your coat, your pickaxe, and get out of this cabin. Now, it is the middle of the night. The snow is, and whose fault is that? He stood, slowly. He did not argue, did not plead. He gathered his things in silence. The movements of a man who knows he has earned exactly what he is getting. At the door, he stopped, did not turn around. The maps I copied, they are in my coat. I will leave them on the porch. And what good does that do me? You have already seen them. You know what is here. You will go back to Eckhart, and you will tell him everything. Silence. Yes, he said. I probably will, because if I do not, he will send someone worse. The door opened. Cold air rushed in. and Garrett Nye walked out into the frozen dark. Marjorie stood in the center of the cabin, alone again. She fed the copies into the fire one by one, watching the pencil lines curl and blacken and vanish. But the damage was done. Garrett knew about the ledger. He knew the general shape of Renwick's discovery, and he was walking back toward Ketchum, back toward Boone Eckhart, slowed by the snow and the cold and his still healing frostbite. But walking, she had maybe a week, maybe less, before Eckhart moved. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire, thinking, planning, turning the problem over and over in her mind. She could not beat Eckhart in a race back to Ketchum. Garrett was traveling light. She had Solomon, but also supplies. She could not fight him. He had money, men, connections. So what did she have? She had the truth. 30 pages of it. She had Renwick's name, his work. Once the surveyor saw the quality of these maps, there would be no denying their authenticity. And she had something Eckhart did not know about. She had been underestimated her entire life, and she had learned a long time ago that being overlooked was not always a curse. Sometimes it was the sharpest tool in the box. At first light, she packed the essential supplies, loaded Solomon, took one last look around the cabin that Josiah Renwick had built with 20 years of solitude and love, the books on the shelves, the maps on the table, the gold still gleaming in its tin box. She could not carry the gold, too heavy. The remaining ledger pages were important but not critical. She would come back. She closed the door and started the long climb out of the gorge. The journey back was harder than the journey in. The snow had transformed the landscape. The switchbacks were buried, the trail invisible. Solomon broke through drifts that reached his chest, his breath coming in great white plumes, his legs churning, his stubborn ancient heart refusing to quit. It took them 2 full days to climb out of the gorge, and when Marjorie reached the top of the ridge and looked back down, she saw smoke. Not the thin, white steam of the hot spring. Dark smoke, black smoke, the kind that comes from burning wood and burning paper and burning books. The cabin was on fire. She could see it far below through the screen of aspens now bare, their golden leaves stripped by the blizzard. The roof was engulfed, flames leaping 30 feet into the cold blue sky. A column of black smoke rising straight up in the windless air. Everything, the books, the journals, the maps on the table, the gold in its tin box, the bed where she had slept, the porch where she had watched the snow fall, the surveying tools, the bottles of ink. 20 years of one man's solitary devotion, burning. Marjorie sank to her knees in the snow. She did not cry. She was past crying, past anything that had a name. She knelt there watching the smoke, and inside her chest, something that had been soft and hopeful finished turning to stone. Eckhart had not waited for Garrett to return. He had sent someone else, a second man following Garrett's tracks into the gorge, with kerosene and orders to burn everything, destroy the evidence, leave nothing, the gold gone. 20 years of patient panning reduced to a puddle of metal in a pile of ash. The journals, Renwick's voice, his thoughts, his poetry of stone and water. Gone. Everything that man had been, everything he had built. Eckhart had turned it to smoke. Marjorie pressed her hand against her chest, felt the oilcloth packet, the 30 pages, still there. Not everything. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff, the smoke still rising behind her. She had no gold, no fortune, no beautiful maps to spread on a table and make a room fall silent with wonder. She had 30 pages, a mule, and a direction, and she had rage, cold, patient, quiet, the kind that does not burn but waits, the kind that Josiah Renwick would have understood. She turned her back on the smoke, took Solomon's lead rope, and walked toward Ketchum. The journey took 8 days, through deep snow, through frozen creeks, through passes where the wind cut like a blade, and the only warmth in the world was Solomon's flank pressed against her side when they sheltered behind rocks at night. She ate the last of her food on the 6th day, drank snowmelt, kept walking. Her body was failing. She could feel it. The stumble in her step, the way her vision blurred at the edges, the cold that had moved from her skin to her bones to somewhere deeper. But she kept walking because those 30 pages were still inside her coat, and every step was a step closer to the land office, and every step was a step closer to the look on Boone Eckhart's face when he realized what she still had. What all his money and all his men and all his fire could not destroy. On the 8th day in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and gold and the shadows of the mountains stretched across the valley, Marjorie Slade walked into the main street of Ketchum. She was gaunt, weathered. Her dress was torn. Her coat was burned at the hem. Her boots were held together with strips of rawhide. Her hair was matted. Her face was raw from wind and cold. Solomon walked beside her, his head low, his one good ear drooping, both of them moving with the slow mechanical determination of creatures operating on nothing but will. The townspeople stared, and standing on the porch of the land office, a whiskey glass in one hand, was Boone Eckhart. His face when he saw her was something Marjorie would remember for the rest of her life, the color draining out of it, the glass stopping halfway to his lips, the eyes going wide, then narrow, then wide again. He had thought she was dead. He had counted on it. The burned cabin, the blizzard, the mountains. He had bet everything on those mountains doing what mountains do to people who are small and alone. And the mountains had lost that bet. Marjorie looked at him. One long, silent moment. Then she walked past him through the door of the land office, and the thud of her boots on the wooden floor was the only announcement she needed. Mr. Tully looked up from his ledger. His face went white. "Miss Slade," he stammered. "We thought you were—" "I need to file a claim," Marjorie said, "and I need to see the territorial surveyor." She placed her hands on the counter. Flat. These hands were not the same hands that had laid $2 silver on this wood weeks ago. These hands were cracked and calloused and scarred. They had dragged a dying man through waist-deep snow, had gripped a mule's lead rope through 8 days of frozen wilderness. Tully's eyes darted past her toward the door. She could feel Eckhart out there, the weight of his attention pressing against her back. "Miss Slade," Tully said, his voice dropping. "There is a complication." "What complication?" The door banged open behind her, heavy boots on the wooden floor, the smell of whiskey and tobacco. "The complication," said Boone Eckhart, "is that you are too late." He walked past her to the counter, planted himself beside her, close enough that she could see the gold threads in his waistcoat. He was smiling, that wide, wet smile she remembered. But there was something different behind it now. Something desperate, trying to look confident. "Tully, show her." The clerk hesitated, then pulled a document from a drawer and laid it on the counter. Marjorie looked at it. Her vision blurred for a moment. Hunger, exhaustion. She blinked, focused. "A land claim, filed 5 days ago, in the name of Boone Eckhart, covering the entire East Fork Basin, the gorge, the valley of the third cabin, and everything east of the current territorial boundary line. Thousands of acres. Based on an independent survey conducted by the claimant establishing that the boundary line of 1863 is in error by approximately 10 miles. Independent survey, conducted by a man who had never set foot past the second ridge. Using data stolen by a spy he had hired to follow a woman he had dismissed as a fool. She looked at Eckhart. He was watching her with the satisfied patience of a cat that has cornered something small. "You seem surprised," he said. "Did you think you were the only one who knew about old Renwick's little hobby? My father told me about that crazy hermit years ago. I have been surveying that land myself for months." "Months," Marjorie said. "Months, in the middle of winter. I am a thorough man." "With what instruments?" "I beg your pardon. What instruments did you use for this independent survey? What kind of theodolite? What chain length? What datum point for your elevations?" Eckhart blinked. "Just once. I do not see how that is relevant." "It is relevant." Marjorie said. Because Josiah Renwick used a Gurley transit with a vernier scale accurate to 30 seconds of arc. His chain measurements were calibrated against a baseline he established using solar observations. His datum point was the summit of Castle Peak, reference to the Coast Survey benchmark of 1859. She paused. What was yours? The silence in the land office was enormous. Tully's pen had stopped. Two men who had followed Eckhart inside stood frozen. Eckhart's smile thinned, just barely, but Marjorie saw it. She had been trained by 21 years of servitude to see everything. This is nonsense, Eckhart said. His voice had gone cold. I have filed a legal claim. It is registered with this office. If you have a dispute, take it to the territorial court. But I warn you. His eyes narrowed. A dismissed servant girl with no money, no lawyer, no reputation, against a man who has been doing business in this territory for 15 years. He leaned closer. How do you think that ends? Marjorie did not step back. And then Eckhart played his second card. There is also, he said, turning to the room. The matter of the fire. What fire? A cabin in the East Fork Gorge, burned to the ground 3 weeks ago. Valuable property on land I have now claimed. He paused. I have a witness who saw you in that cabin the day before it burned. A prospector named Garrett Nye, who will testify that you were the last person inside before the fire. The air left the room. Marjorie stared at him. He was accusing her of arson, of burning the cabin that he had ordered burned, using a witness that he had hired, to destroy the evidence that he had tried to steal. For one long, terrible second, she felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. The old familiar despair. The broken pitcher. The smug face of the mistress. The closed door. The certainty that the powerful would always win and the powerless would always lose. That second lasted a long time, and then it passed. Because she was not in a parlor in Boise anymore. She was standing in a land office with 30 pages of truth inside her coat. And she was noticing something Boone Eckhart had missed entirely. He was afraid, under the bluster, under the smile. He was afraid. Because his claim was built on stolen fragments, incomplete data. He did not have the proof. He did not have the boundary calculations. He did not even know they existed. He was bluffing, hoping she would fold. She almost did. But Josiah Renwick had not built a trail of tests for someone who folded. Marjorie turned to Tully, her voice calm, measured. I want to see the territorial surveyor, Mr. Calloway, today. Eckhart scoffed. Calloway will confirm my claim. He is a professional. Good. Then he will have no objection to a field verification. A what? A field verification. You say you surveyed that land yourself. You filed a claim based on your own independent work. So prove it. Let Calloway take your survey and my evidence into the field. Compare both against the actual terrain. If your survey matches the land, you keep your claim. I walk away. Forever. She paused. Let the silence build. But if it does not match, if your survey contains errors that prove you never set foot on that land, then your claim is fraudulent. And fraud, Mr. Eckhart, is a matter for the territorial marshal, not the territorial court. Eckhart's face went through several expressions at once. Anger, calculation, fear, and something that might have been respect before fury swallowed it whole. He could not refuse. If he refused a field verification, he was admitting his survey was false, in front of witnesses, in a room full of men who had watched him file that claim 5 days ago. If he backed down now, his word was worthless, and reputation was everything in a territory this small. Fine, he said, his voice tight as a wire. Let Calloway verify. Marjorie nodded, turned, and walked out. She made it around the corner before her knees buckled. She caught herself against the wall, forehead pressed against the rough wood. Breathing, just breathing. She had challenged the most powerful man in the territory to prove his own lie. With nothing but 30 pages and the conviction that truth applied with enough pressure to exactly the right spot could crack even the thickest armor. What if she was wrong? She pressed her hands against the wood, felt the grain, the splinters, the solid, honest reality of it. She was not wrong. She knew Renwick's work. She had memorized those 30 pages during 3 days of blizzard. She knew the numbers, the coordinates, the calculations, and no amount of hastily copied general maps could reproduce the precision of a man who had spent 20 years measuring the mountains with instruments calibrated against the stars. Mr. Calloway arrived the next morning, a quiet, meticulous, gray-haired man with careful, deliberate movements and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked at Marjorie with gentle curiosity. A man who has heard an extraordinary rumor and is reserving judgment until he sees the evidence. She showed him the 30 pages. In private. In the back room of the boarding house where she had taken a bed, with the last coins Tully had secretly pressed into her hand. An act of quiet conscience from a frightened man. Calloway sat at the table, adjusted his spectacles, opened the oilcloth packet. He said nothing for a very long time. His fingers moved over the pages, tracing the lines, the notations, the angular measurements, the elevation calculations. His lips moved as he checked the mathematics. His eyebrows rose, fell, rose again. After an hour, he looked up. His face had changed. He looked lit from within. Who did this work? A man named Josiah Renwick. He lived alone in the Sawtooth Range for 20 years. Alone. Alone. Calloway shook his head slowly. Miss Slade, this is the most precise survey work I have ever seen. including my own, including the government's. He paused, and if his boundary calculations are correct, and I believe they are, then the official line is wrong by a significant margin. Can you prove it in the field? Give me a week.
The verification expedition left 3 days later. Calloway, Marjorie, 2 of his assistants, Boone Eckhart. Eckhart's lawyer, Whitfield, brought in from Boise at considerable expense, and 6 townspeople who had volunteered as witnesses, including Pruitt from the livery, who gave Marjorie a small nod as they mounted up. Solomon carried Marjorie's supplies, his one good ear swiveling at the parade of humans and horses with a look that said, clearly, this is going to end with someone shouting and me standing in the cold. The journey to the boundary region took 4 days. Eckhart rode at the front, talking loudly, pointing at landmarks, making observations that Calloway noted without comment. Marjorie rode at the back, silent. On the 5th day, Calloway set up his instruments on a high ridge overlooking the disputed territory. Clear, cold morning. Mountains standing sharp against a sky so blue it looked painted. He took his readings, checked them, took them again, compared them to Eckhart's filed survey, then compared them to Renwick's pages. The process took 2 days. Calloway was thorough. He measured, calculated, measured again. His assistants ran chain lines, took sightings, recorded data. Eckhart grew restless by the 2nd hour, agitated by the 6th. By the end of the 1st day, he had stopped making observations and started making threats. On the evening of the 2nd day, Calloway called the group together. They stood on the ridge, the setting sun painting the Sawtooth Range in shades of gold and amber and deep burning red. Calloway's voice was measured, professional. But underneath the calm was a tremor of something, the controlled thrill of a man announcing a discovery.
I have completed my verification.
He held up Eckhart's filed survey.
Mr. Eckhart, your survey contains 47 significant errors. Your elevation readings are off by an average of 200 feet. Your angular measurements do not correspond to any observable landmarks. Your chain distances are inconsistent with the actual terrain by margins that cannot be explained by instrument error.
He let the words settle. In my professional judgment, this survey was not conducted in the field. It was fabricated from incomplete second-hand data. It is fraudulent. Eckhart's face went white. Red. White again. His hands clenched at his sides.
This is absurd.
His voice cracking.
You are in collusion with this woman.
Calloway held up his other hand. In it were Renwick's pages. In contrast, the survey work of Josiah Renwick is flawless. Every measurement I have been able to verify matches his calculations to within the margin of instrument precision. His work confirms that the territorial boundary line of 1863 was placed approximately 10 miles too far to the west. The land beyond that line is legally unclaimed. He looked at Marjorie.
Miss Slade,
wherever did you find this man's work?
He found me,
Marjorie said. In a manner of speaking, Whitfield the lawyer was already backing away. taking small steps toward his horse. "Boone," Whitfield said, his voice careful. "I think we should discuss." "There is nothing to discuss," Eckhart snarled. "This woman is a liar, a thief, and an arsonist. She burned that cabin in the gorge." "I have a witness." "Your witness," said a voice from behind the group. Everyone turned, standing at the edge of the firelight, having approached so quietly that no one had heard him, was Garrett Nye. He looked terrible, gaunt, haggard, his clothes torn, his beard wild, and his hands. Both hands wrapped in thick bandages stained through with something dark, the color of old blood. He was swaying on his feet. The last reserves of whatever had carried him up this mountain visibly draining away. But his gray eyes were clear, focused, fixed on Boone Eckhart. "Your witness is right here." Eckhart stared at him, the calculation behind his eyes visible to everyone now. The mask gone. "Nye, you and I had an arrangement." "We did." Garrett nodded. "You paid me $50 to follow Miss Slade into the mountains, to find out what Renwick had hidden." "That is a lie. It is the truth. I followed her from Ketchum, found the second cabin, tried to break in, could not, followed the wrong trail, nearly died in the blizzard. She found me, saved my life, and I repaid her by stealing pages from the ledger while she slept." Total silence around the fire. 6 witnesses, the surveyor, the lawyer, all watching. But that is not all. Garrett turned to the group, his bandaged hands held out before him. "When I returned to Ketchum, I told Eckhart what I had found. He was furious I had not gotten more, called me useless, paid me 10 of the 50 he owed. Then he sent another man back into the mountains, a man named Harshaw.
Eckhart told me Harshaw was going to finish the job, get the rest, and if the cabin could not be secured, burn it, destroy it, leave nothing."
"You are a liar,"
Eckhart said. But his voice had gone thin, reedy. "I went back," Garrett said. "After you sent Harshaw, I followed him. Took me 6 days in the snow. Bad trail, worse weather. When I got to the gorge, the cabin was already burning. Harshaw was gone, but the fire was still hot. Some things had not burned all the way through." He lifted his bandaged hands. "I pulled what I could from the ashes." He reached inside his coat, slowly, painfully, his bandaged fingers clumsy, and produced a bundle wrapped in a scorched piece of canvas. He laid it on a flat rock near the fire, unwrapped it, pages, charred at the edges, blackened by smoke, but legible. Renwick's handwriting,
Renwick's maps. Damaged, incomplete, but unmistakably real.
And beneath the pages, a small lump of metal, misshapen, dull. But even in the firelight, its color was unmistakable. Gold, melted and reformed by the heat into a rough nugget the size of a man's thumb. Garrett straightened up, looked at Eckhart. I burned my hands pulling that out of the fire. The fire you ordered, on the cabin you never built, on land you never surveyed. Containing the life's work of a man your father tried to murder 20 years ago. Eckhart lunged, not with words, with his body. 2 of the townsmen grabbed his arms and held him. The sounds that came from him were not words. They were the sounds of a man watching the architecture of his life collapse. He thrashed against the men holding him, his face purple. Whitfield was already on his horse, riding away without a word. Calloway stepped forward.
Based on the evidence presented, I am recommending to the territorial governor that Mr. Eckhart's claim be voided on grounds of fraud. I am further recommending that Miss Slade's claim, based on the verified survey work of Josiah Renwick, be granted priority filing status. And I am referring the matter of the arson to the territorial marshal for criminal investigation. He looked at Eckhart. You are finished, sir.
3 words, delivered with the quiet precision of a man who measures things for a living. Marjorie watched it all from the edge of the firelight. She did not gloat. She did not smile. What she felt was something quieter, sadder. The feeling of standing at the end of a very long road and realizing that the road itself had been the point. She looked at Garrett, his bandaged hands, his exhausted face. The guilt and the grief and the strange broken courage it had taken to walk back into that burning gorge and pull a dead man's legacy from the flames. She did not forgive him. Not yet. That word was too large for this moment. But she saw him for the first time. Not the spy, not the liar, but the man who had burned his own hands trying to make it right. Thank you, she said. Garrett nodded, his gray eyes bright.
That is more than I earned,
he said. Yes, she said, it is. The return to Ketchum was different. The whispers were different. The faces in the windows, the men on the saloon porch, they still stared. But the quality of their staring had changed. It was not pity anymore, not scorn. It was something she had never experienced before. Respect. Boone Eckhart was escorted to the marshal's office by 2 witnesses. He went quietly. The fight had gone out of him on the trail down from the ridge. He looked smaller, deflated, his waistcoat hanging loose. He did not look at Marjorie as he passed. Mr. Tully resigned his position the same day, left a note on the counter that said simply, I am sorry. Not enough, but something. The formal filing took a week. Calloway handled the paperwork with meticulous care. Every form completed, every boundary described. He worked long hours, determined that this claim would be unassailable. The claim was granted on a Tuesday morning, a cold, clear day in early spring. Snow melting on the peaks, creeks running high and fast. Marjorie Slade, landowner. The same words Tully had written on her first deed. The $2 deed. But these words described something different. Not a collapsed cabin in a forgotten meadow, but a valley, a gorge. Thousands of acres of timber and water and stone. She held the document outside the land office, read her own name, and felt the sensation of a seed finally touching soil after being carried a very long way by a very strong wind. The long journey over, the real work about to begin. 6 months later, the valley that Josiah Renwick had made his cathedral came to be known as Renwick Valley, because that is what Marjorie called it. And what Marjorie called things had a way of sticking now. She built a new cabin on the old stone foundation, smaller than Renwick's Grand Lodge, but solid, sound, using his techniques, his joinery, his respect for the wood. The morning sun fell across the same stone porch. Garrett Nye came back. She did not invite him. He appeared one morning at the edge of the valley, leading a pack horse loaded with timber, his hands still bandaged. The scars would be permanent. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply started working, splitting wood, hauling stone, day after day, week after week, silent, steady, and Marjorie, slowly, in her own time. Let him stay. Trust once broken does not snap back into place. It grows again the way a fractured bone knits, slowly, fiber by fiber, and always carrying the memory of the break. But she saw the care he took with the land, the way Renwick would have wanted. He managed the small, sustainable timber operation she established on the far side of the valley, selecting only fallen or aging trees, preserving the old growth. Using the charred pages he had pulled from the fire with his own hands as his guide, families settled the lower valley, hand-picked by Marjorie. People who worked hard, kept their word, looked at the land not as something to consume, but as something to care for. A schoolhouse went up, a gristmill on the river. Boone Eckhart was convicted of land fraud and destruction of property, fined the entirety of his holdings, banned from the territory. He left on a gray morning in March on a rented horse. He did not look back. On a warm evening in late summer, Mr. Calloway rode into the valley, spectacles glinting, a large rolled document under his arm. Marjorie met him on the porch. He unrolled a newly printed official map of the territory on the porch railing.
the corrected boundary line drawn in bold red ink, and within the new lands the boundaries of her claim, her valley, her home.
He was a remarkable man, Calloway said quietly, to have done all this alone for so many years. He looked at Marjorie.
People are calling you the queen of the sawtooths.
Marjorie smiled, a small private expression.
They have it wrong.
Calloway tilted his head.
What will you call this place officially? The deed needs a name.
Marjorie looked out at the valley. The aspens were green now, their leaves trembling in the evening breeze, making that soft, shimmering sound, like the mountains whispering to each other. Solomon stood in the meadow below, his gray coat catching the last of the light, his one good ear pointed in her direction. His expression, for once, not skeptical, not resigned, just still, content. An old creature who had finally found the meadow where he would spend his remaining days in peace.
She thought of the servant girl who had arrived in Ketchum with nothing, the $2 silver on the counter, the hearthstone, the map, the trail. She thought of Josiah Renwick, his patience, his trust in a stranger he would never meet. She thought of Garrett's scarred hands, Calloway's kind eyes, Solomon's stubborn hooves on the narrow ledge, the blizzard, the fire, the 30 pages that had outlasted everything else. She had not found gold. The gold was gone. All that remained was a single misshapen nugget on her mantelpiece. Not wealth, a reminder. She had found something worth more. The place where her name meant something, where the work of her hands and the patience of her heart had built something that would outlast her, the way Renwick's work had outlasted him. I did not build this, she said, her voice quiet and clear, carrying the entire weight of her journey in 6 small words. I just found my way home. Thank you so much for staying with us for this incredible story of resilience and hidden worth. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not by those who seek to conquer, but by those who have the patience to listen. If you were moved by Marjorie's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story about the quiet power of patience. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will not miss our next tale. Until then, take care.